Hi guys, welcome to the Franky Balls Show, starring Franky Balls with my lifestyle coaching podcast. This podcast, we're going to cover everything from cold approach pickup and business to relationships and time management. I think it's very important for anybody who's going to start following and taking advice from somebody in a life coaching program to understand what their life is like and decide for themselves if they have the kind of life that you would want to emulate. So, with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys what my life is like. And some people will probably love the kind of life that I live, and others are likely going to just hate it and maybe even despise it. Okay, so first of all, I've been married for 20 years now. I got married as soon as I turned 19, and I'm just about 39 now. I was married for 10 years, and I spent 10 years really learning how to run a relationship properly. I read all of the relationship books, and I spent a lot of time trying to make my relationship a very healthy and fulfilling one, and I succeeded at that. After about 10 years, though, I started to decide, you know what? I'm happy with everything in my relationship. I love my wife. I had 2 kids with her, still have 2 kids with her. We're still currently married, but after 10 years, we decided to have an open relationship and open things right up. So we've been in an open relationship now for 10 years, and we've had all different kinds of phases for those 10 years. We've tried the swinger thing, we've tried the online dating thing, we've tried just about everything you can imagine that a couple would go through in a relationship. And finally, today we are in just a normal open relationship. She dates whoever the heck she wants to date. I date whoever the heck I want to date, but we still live in the same house. We're still happy together. We still love each other. We still raise our 2 kids together. And as far as I'm concerned, and as far as she's concerned, I think we have the perfect relationship. Some people look at that and they're disgusted by it, but I am very red pill. And I think it's an awesome relationship. If you talk to my wife, I think she would tell you the same thing. So how did I get into cold approach pickup? It was actually suggested by my wife. About 6 years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago, she went out on a date with a guy, and she came home and had this story about this guy doing the cube with her. For those of you who don't know much about cold approach pickup, the cube's just kind of a generic story about telling a girl to imagine a horse and a table and pretending that these objects that she imagines mean different things. So she came home from an awesome date with a guy, and we always talk about her dates. And she told me all these stories about this guy and how awesome he was and everything, and she was pretty impressed by him. And then a few days later, she came back and she brought me a book called Daygame. So like probably many of you listening to this program, she was the one that introduced me to the original book that got many of us into cold approach pickup, called Daygame. So I read Daygame, and that's how I first started to get into cold approach pickup. So for a couple of years, I studied cold approach pickup. I still study cold approach pickup, but for a couple of years it was mostly just a study, because even though I was married to my wife for the whole time that I've been in pickup, I think I'm the only professional pickup artist in the world that's been married the whole entire time that they're in the game, and stays married and has his wife also know what cold approach pickup is and even encourages him to do it. So I learned cold approach pickup, but at that time I was still dating different girls, but all long term. I was never going out, hitting the streets, hitting the bars, doing cold approach pickup, and just essentially doing fucking chucks. I wasn't ever really into that until recently. So what I would do is I would learn a whole bunch. I've bought every single program out there probably. I've spent probably $50,000 on different boot camp programs. Just about everybody that's major in the industry that's had any kind of a massive impact on it, I've probably bought a program from them and learned their theory. I've spent tens of thousands of hours probably reading and listening to the theory, as well as like a ton of time in field. But as soon as I would get in field and find a decent girl, I would always start a relationship. I've always been a relationship guy. I love relationships. The first part of meeting a girl has never excited me near as much as 5 or 10 dates in. When the girl really starts to open up, that's the kind of relationship that I've always really enjoyed. So during the last 10 years with my wife being in an open relationship, I've also been in a dozen long-term relationships with other girls. Some of them knew about my wife, and others I just kept it not a secret, but the relationship was only 3 or 4 months, and we just never talked about whether we were dating other people or not. So that's how I got into cold approach pickup, and a lot of my podcast will likely be what I'm going to call the first 1,000 approaches. I recorded every single one of my first 1,000 Daygame cold approach pickups. So a lot of my life coaching program that revolves around cold approach pickup is just going to be these first 1,000 cold approach pickups and me analyzing them, and maybe getting some other famous and really good coaches to do some analysis on them as well, and give everybody that's getting into cold approach pickup an idea as to what to expect for your first 1,000 sets. And maybe if you have really severe approach anxiety, maybe you can go through those first 1,000 sets and get an idea as to some of the early things that you can learn from them. I'm not going to put all 1,000 sets online. What I'll probably do is I'll just put every 50 sets or so, I'll put a couple of good sets, a couple of average sets, and a couple of shitty sets for those 50 sets, and we'll kind of analyze them. All right, moving on to business. Business, about 10 years ago, I started a mining company, a very small mining company. And it was just me as a sole entrepreneur 10 years ago. I just about went broke in 2008 during the Great Recession, as people call it. And I actually had to have my mom mortgage her house to bail me out. Fast forward about 10 years after that, I now run a business with about 50 employees, and it is currently the largest privately owned mining company in Western Canada. So I've went through the process of starting, running, maintaining, and building a fairly large business. It could be a lot bigger than that if I wanted it to be, but those are the lessons that I've learned in business that I find are very red pill and often very secretive, and not very many business people like to even talk about them. For the business and money portion, I'm going to talk about how you can start a legitimate business. I'm not talking about one of these kind of odd one-person businesses or one of these types of businesses where in reality all you really are is a franchise holder. I'm talking about true entrepreneurship. I'm talking about true lessons. I'm talking about the hard truths that I so far have never seen in business books, because they're very blue pill and very feel-good type books. The lessons I've learned in business turned out to be very difficult and hard to learn. That brings me to my final thing that I think anybody who's going to have an amazing life needs to realize. And that is time management, owning your own time. Right now, I feel like I own my own time because I usually only work about 1 or 2 hours a day, even with 50 employees. And it seems like the more employees I get, almost the less amount that I have to work, because I can afford to pay better people to manage the company for me. I don't think that's always the case, and I don't think you can ever start your business that way. For 10 years, or for at least a good 6 or 7 years, it was extremely hard work starting my business. It was taking 14 to 16 hours a day every day, and there was also a little bit of luck sprinkled in there that most successful business owners refuse to recognize, but I think is almost always the case. But you are going to have to put yourself through that. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, a successful one, you're going to have to bust your ass for between 5 and 10 years, and you're also going to have a little bit of luck. After you put your sweat equity in, most of the time, for most of the business owners that I know, they found a way to replace themselves. They found a way to make systems in their business to make the business run, for the most part, without them. But for those first 5 or 10 years, you just have to put the sweat equity in. You know, I don't think there's any other way of doing that. But also know, if you put 5 or 10 years into your business and it's not running itself at that point, I think you did something dramatically wrong. Okay, so those are the 4 areas I think that are the most important for a life coach, and that's kind of my how my life has shaped up. I have 50 employees. I make about $1 million a year or more almost every year. I've been married for 20 years with 2 kids. I'm in a happy marriage. I love my marriage. And I love cold approach pickup. Recently, over the last year or so, I've really gotten into being just a cold approach pickup artist without the relationship aspect. So now I'm trying to shift my focus from being in multiple long-term relationships and learning how the intricacies of those multiple long-term relationships work to more cold approach pickup. I think the reason that I'm doing that is mostly just because I have never been the best at the first, let's say, 7 hours of pickup. I've always kind of got momentum and gone out a whole bunch and got, you know, momentum from just being very social for like a month or 2 period of time. And as soon as you get that momentum and you start increasing your vibe over a month or 2, you get that first girlfriend, and then that's a part I always loved. So then I'd get into a multiple longer-term relationship with that girl, and I'd kind of drop off the face of the earth with the cold approach pickup thing until either that girl and I broke up, or until occasionally my wife would say, hey, you're way too serious with this girl. You know, I'd appreciate it if you could, you know, exit that relationship if there's ever like a natural break in it. And my wife's always been my number one, so I'd always respect her in that ordeal and do that for her. Now I want to really get good at cold approach pickup. I think I'm to the point now where I want to focus on those first 7 hours. And like I said, I've recorded my first 1,000 sets of mostly Daygame, almost exclusively Daygame, and starting out very structured. And like I said, with the structured stuff, I've tried the natural way. Natural way works. I'm not trying to discredit anything natural, but like I was mentioning before, I've been on multiple boot camps. I've spent probably about, well, over $50,000 on boot camps with different guys. And the one thing that forced me or pressured me into going natural or going structured with my game was actually because I would pay for a boot camp. I would listen to these very prominent pickup artists' YouTube channels. I'd watch all their stuff, and I would watch them constantly saying stuff like, hey, you got to be natural, you know, just be yourself and everything. And so I'd try that in field for, you know, 6 weeks or so before I showed up on their boot camp. And then I'd get on their boot camp, and almost without exception, their game would be very, very, very structured, to the point where the most prominent pickup artist boot camp that I've ever taken, that also was almost derogatory towards people that were using structured game. When I showed up on his boot camp, the first thing he told me to go tell somebody was to go ask a girl, who lies more, men or women? And for almost everybody listening to this, I imagine you've probably heard that saying from the game. So I often showed up on these boot camps with the promise that they were going to teach you how to do natural stuff. And most of the time, the instructor, the YouTube star, the person that had created this following and told everybody to do natural game was using, in large part, structured game. You know, I think they honestly felt like that wasn't structured because they'd probably done it so many times, but a lot of the things they were saying were still being, you could still find them in places like the game or, you know, just different forums and stuff. It's very rare that I'd find somebody that was actually a true natural, although it was very common for people to say they were a true natural. So that's one of the things, that's one of the misconceptions that I seen in game, and why I did my cold approach pickup 1,000 sets in a very structured way. When you're talking about structured game, the reason it's much more easy to learn is you're only changing one small variable at a time. If you only change one small variable at a time and you do multiple sets again and again and again, and you're only changing one small thing, you get a very strong sense over what that one thing that you're changing does. When you're doing natural game, you're changing oftentimes 15 or 20 or 50 things at a time, and if you do 50 or 100 sets, you don't really know for sure what changed because it's all natural and multiple variables are changing at the same time. So that's my opening podcast for my life coaching podcast. That's kind of how my life is. I'm doing this mostly just for art. I'm never planning on making any money off this podcast. I just know that when I look at my life, there's one thing that's missing, and that's usually something that has to do with art. So this podcast is just going to be my life's artwork, and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it can help some people. Cheers.